Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About the Middle East. I'm Andy Blanche.
And I'm Juliana Musheyev, and John Dickman is here today helping us with the show.
On this show, we talk about the Middle East, its culture, politics, religion, history, just about anything that captures the complexity of the region.
We hope to promote open and honest discussion about the conflict in Israel and Palestine, and to humanize the conflict by getting to know people who have a stake in the issues.
On this show, we work to dispel stereotypes about people from the Middle East. This is an ongoing issue, and it's getting worse in the current political environment, where making people afraid of others seems to be a conscious political strategy. There are two countries in the Middle East that bear a particularly heavy load of misinformation and misunderstanding: Iran and Saudi Arabia. Today we'll be focusing on Saudi Arabia, and we're pleased to tell you that next month we have a show planned on Iran.
Today we'll be interviewing Wayne and Patti Eastep. Wayne has a Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in New York and studied liberation theology with Philip Berrigan. He is a world-recognized photographer who produces documentaries focusing on culture and ethnic diversity and has worked in more than 125 countries. His wife, Patti, is an accomplished actress and vocalist who has performed in theater, television, and film. She is also a researcher and has traveled extensively and studied the cultures in Japan, Kazakhstan, and the Middle East. The Easteps lived for a number of months with the Amrah Bedouin tribe in Saudi Arabia and wrote an award-winning book about their experience called Bedouin, an in-depth exploration of nomadic life.
Thanks so much for joining us, Wayne and Patti.
Thank you.
Wayne, you've described your photography as a way to build bridges between groups. You've also talked about the importance of authenticity in your images. Can you tell us a little bit about your philosophy about photography and the work you do, and maybe give us an example of why you think it's important to approach photography in this way?
Since I was young, I've always been a keen observer. And as I developed as an adult and started to sort out what I was going to do, one of the notions that I had was writing or using poetry, because they were a language to facilitate this sort of high interest that I had in observation. But I discovered that I really didn't have a talent at writing or at poetry, but I did have a gift at creating visual languages through photography in particular. So that's what I cultivated through an apprenticeship. And I was privileged to apprentice at Magnum with some premier photojournalists, and I learned about the documentary tradition. I also learned about the ethics of photojournalism, and so that informed my professional path. I could use images as visual language to tell a story, and that had multiple benefits to it. One, images are pregnant with detail, so it provided a lot of information to the observer. Secondly, if you work out of an awareness within yourself as the creator to try to be truthful about what you're photographing and to be a witness and have it be observation, the images, then you can provide a reservoir of information that people can interpret themselves. The images don't need a caption, really. And the person can determine what it's saying and what their takeaway is. I'll give you a real simple snapshot. When we were living with the Bedouins, we lived with a clan. There were 125 people. They lived in family units in their own tents, often a half a mile from each other. And there were 1,200 camels. There were 700 sheep and goats and over a half dozen beautiful Arabian horses, Saluki dogs, and falcons. So we had access, and we were in the desert in the south with beautiful sand dunes. And I could have asked them to stage a scene and have created one of the most romantic desert scenes right out of Lawrence of Arabia. But because I was trying to work truthfully about their story, I did not do that. They migrate not in rows of hundreds and hundreds of camels, although the camels are moving with them, but they move with Mercedes-Benz water tankers and with GMC pickup trucks, and that's the modern way that they get about. And so the photograph in the book that shows them migrating, in fact, is of the trucks. So that's a simple example of where you use your integrity in terms of the actual making of the image.
That's really interesting. There must have been a lot of choices you had to make in order to convey the truth of what you were seeing as you went.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So how did this all come about in the first place? How did you end up living with a tribe of Bedouins in Saudi Arabia? Not a usual thing for a boy from New York and his actress wife.
It got more unusual as we started going toward it. One factor was my work in graduate school. I studied comparative religions, and Islam was one of the things which for me in school was a blank slate. I learned about Islam, and I had a piqued interest as a result. I grew up in a nomadic way, moving. By the time I got to college, I had been in 13 different schools. So I sort of emotionally had a point of reference that was nomadic. At the point that I was transitioning from being an apprentice to being a professional, I reflected on what is it that I'm going to do. And the thing that interested me the most was nomadic life. So I began researching, and the result of that research was that I discovered this unique tribe called the Amrah in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, who have an unbroken bloodline. They are known in the Arabian Peninsula as the Bedou of the Bedou, which means the nomads of the nomads. There's a saying that in the sky, there is the telegraph. On the ground, there is the Amrah. And what that means is that they have a means of communicating that's as fast as the telegraph. We saw that happen. So I thought, well, if this tribe is still in place and they've lasted millennia, there must be something of merit to learn from them. My interest was to see things firsthand rather than read and write about it. And so I decided to reach out to them and see if I couldn't do a documentary study about who they were.
That's interesting. So it was really your idea.
Yes. And then it took me 12 trips over a 2.5-year period before I got permission from them to live with them and document their way of life.
12 years to build a level of trust.
2 years.
2 years,
12 trips.
12 trips.
And I flew from New York to Riyadh.
Yeah, interesting.
It was terrifying. It was enlightening, and ultimately it was liberating, which probably is an interesting combination for people to hear about living with a Bedouin tribe. The main thing that struck me when we first got there, which, sometimes you don't think these things through as much as you should ahead of time, is that there really was not any frame of reference for anything. Everything was different. The language, the environment, the sun, the heat, the sand, and everything. The language was completely different. The dress. They had two of their provisions for our coming were that we would dress and live and eat as they did, and that we would not bring an interpreter. So we had taken a crash course in Arabic, which was enough so that we could communicate, but not so much that we could always understand what they said back to us, which was kind of a shame. That was due to our limited vocabulary. But I remember, before we were going over there, I remember thinking, of course I was much younger then, oh, this is going to be so cool. I'm going to wear a burqa. I'm going to, the whole 9 yards. I feel like the guy in Fawlty Towers. I know nothing. I got over there and I realized you have to eat with the burqa on. How do you do that? And I was a great source of entertainment for them because for the first, I'd say about a week, I could not eat with that on without getting food all in the inside of it. It was,
man.
But they helped me. They showed me how to do it, and that and other things, and so gradually, I started to feel more at home. They also, in the very beginning, they tested our mettle. It's a difficult place to live, the desert, and they knew they were in charge of our safety, so they tested us from time to time just to see if we were weenies or if we were going to be able to make it.
Interesting.
And that was interesting. Yeah, that was interesting. One of the things that surprised me was they had a wonderful sense of humor. They were extremely generous and very clever. I remember one day I went from our little sleeping tent over to the main tent, and the women were very excited to see me, and they had a beautiful little sewing machine that they made clothes on. They had made me the most gorgeous green silk dress. They wanted me to put it on, so I put it on. Fit perfect. And I didn't know they were making this. I didn't know anything about this. So they put the dress on me, and I put my burqa back on and a special headscarf, and they perfumed me and wafted me with incense. And I'm like, whoa, this is nice. I can get used to this. And then something else happened, and I'll let Wayne tell the rest of this story.
At the time that what Patty's describing was going on, I was seated in what is called the majlis, which is sort of the public area of the tent, and it's divided by a tent wall, and behind the tent wall is the women's quarters, which is the harem. And the sheikh said, I want you to meet someone. And so I got up with him, and we started heading toward the harem. And he said, one of my other wives is here. And I thought, I didn't know what to think. I was sort of in a little sense of shock that I'm getting ready to go into the harem, and I'm getting ready to meet one of his wives. So I go in there, and there's a group of women, of course, and there's this very attractive woman in this gorgeous green dress, and it smells so delicious in there with the incense and the perfume. And then he says, I want to introduce you to my wife. And he goes and he takes her veil and lifts her veil up. Well, I didn't know what to do or how to respond. I was in shock because I thought, what do I even say? And when he pulled the veil back, I discovered what was going on. Then it was Patti. Well, needless to say, everyone, all the women and the men, were in hysterics over this practical joke, which got retold over and over in the following weeks.
Well, so much for the stereotype of Saudi Arabians being humorless.
Oh, forget about it. No, they are anything but. No, they're anything but. No.
That's a great story.
Well, one other thing I wanted to mention was that, and this impressed me, I've thought about it a lot since we were over there. It was the juxtaposition of the difficulty and the danger that they lived with, living where they did, because it was a very difficult life. But on the other hand, they were so nurturing, they were flexible, practical, they worked as a team. It was a wonderful thing to see, actually. And that was that made a big impression on me. And but the biggest takeaway I had from the whole trip was that I found out what a strong person I am, in a way that I always thought, well, yeah, you're pretty strong. But I found out that I am really an incredibly strong person. If I could do that, I could do anything.
Right.
And that's never left me. It's a gift that I received that's never left me.
I'll just contribute a couple things. These are going to be staccato about what I got from them. One is that of the concept to yield, not to always be forcing your way, to have flexibility and yield. Another was the capacity to be present. They were unique in that way, and they were extremely comfortable with silence because they were so comfortable within themselves, and they were comfortable being in the physical place and among the people, and so they could be comfortable in silence. Another was the value of asking questions that you know the answers to. I saw this done countless times to great benefit for them, because they have a gift at reading body language. So they will ask a person a question that they know the answer to, and the person will give the answer. They will be really not listening so much to the answer as they are watching their eyes, their mouths, their hands, their repositioning themselves, various physical clues that indicate whether you're covering up or whether you're comfortable with what you've said. And then they will ask a series of questions before they ever get around to asking the question to which they don't have the answer. Then when they ask that question, they have a context with which to judge whether to trust the answer that you give to the question that they really want an answer to.
That is so interesting, because there's Middle Eastern culture has a reputation of being indirect, not asking questions directly, and this would provide a reason for that, because they're gathering information in other ways when it seems like they're going around the bush. Very, very interesting.
Absolutely,
Yes.
yeah.
Fascinating.
I want to just add one or two quick things on what we got from them. Another is that your reputation is the highest value asset that you have. That family is at the core and orients their lives. And the other thing is that they were a definition for me of what it means to be cultivated and to be civilized. So those are some of the takeaways that I had.
Fantastic. That leads actually directly into the next thing I wanted to ask you about. People really have a lot of misconceptions about Middle Eastern culture in general, and particularly about nomadic lifestyles. In fact, when you use the term tribal, it conjures up images in people's minds of primitiveness, uncivilized, ungovernable. But when we've talked in the past, you've conveyed an image of a pretty sophisticated and egalitarian political structure in the tribe. Can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe about other things that really contradict some of the common stereotypes that people have?
Yeah, I'll give you a snapshot of the organization. You have a family unit, a husband and a wife and their children. All the brothers of one family unit make up what is called a clan. Those usually stay together, and they will move together. So that's the unit that's migrating in the desert. And that'll be, 100, 150 people. Then the clans make up the tribe. And each clan has a person that's in charge that they refer to as the sheikh. And that's the simple description of the order. The sheikh is not always the oldest son in the family. It is the person who has been chosen because that person demonstrates the ability of a number of key characteristics. One, good judgment, because they're going to decide where they will migrate to. They make a mistake, you start losing livestock. Of being able to mediate, because there's always the human personality and there are conflicts,
Right.
so they solve these. Of being equitable, they pretty much control the money and the resources, so if they distributed those equitably to people, then there's harmony. If they favor others, then there's disharmony. So that person must demonstrate this ability to operate in a balanced way. The tribes, of which there are many in Saudi Arabia, make up the country. The king, again, is chosen for these characteristics, not because they're the oldest. And they have power from two sources. One source is that they have been voted and given that power by a political authority. Secondly, they only keep that power by doing the same thing as the sheikhs. In other words, they're in charge of all the interest of the country and the tribes. And if a group of tribes fell out of harmony with the leadership and they felt they were being slighted and other tribes were being favored, then you've got a recipe for conflict. So it's the role of the king to be mindful of this and to be equitable. And that power, people think the king is, because he's a monarch, that he is the ultimate source of all authority and power. And in one respect, that's true. But in another respect, he is very weak. Because if he fails to serve the interest of the people, then the power dissipates. There's a saying in Arabic that he who rules best serves the most. And so that is the political structure, sort of in broad brushstrokes.
So really, you're describing a situation where the power really comes from the members of the tribe up, rather than from an authority down.
That's right. One morning we were awakened at 4:00 and we went on a trip to determine where we were going to migrate to. And so as we drove along, we went, maybe 200 or 300 miles south, and various members were arguing back and forth. And after a couple of hours, the sheikh finally has said nothing, points in a particular direction. We end up where he pointed to. And when we arrived there was a huge body of water. He said, "This is where we will go." Now, his word was final, but he let everyone have their say, and they were arguing back and forth for that entire period of time.
Fascinating.
Patti, could you speak about the status of and role of women in the tribe?
I would be happy to do that. Since folks that I know have many stereotypes. Now, I also should mention that we were in the desert. We were with Bedouin women. We were not really in the city too often. From time to time we went in. But the city people they're a little different than the Bedouins. Just like city people here are a little different than people in the country. People who work on a farm or something like that. The women, contrary to popular opinion over here, at least the Bedouin women, their observations, their counsel is sought and it's valued. Just to give you an example, when strangers come into the camp, or even maybe, long lost relatives show up, they stay on the women's side of the tent. The guests are in with the men in the majlis. But they listen. They observe everything that goes on. They have little peepholes in the tent wall, so they can watch and see how people are positioning themselves, what they're saying, and make a long story short, when the people leave, they're asked for their opinions about things. And they're kind of the keepers of the keys there, so to speak.
So they have power. They have some power.
Yes, they do have power. And speaking of power, they're the strongest women I think some of the strongest women I've ever been around. Not only physically, but just mentally, they're tough. They're tough. One day when we were migrating, Wayne and I guess we were kind of in the ozone, and we had not got the memo that first thing in the morning they were moving this camp out. So we wake up, we look out the tent door, and the trucks are rolling out. They're leaving. And Baina, who was kind of our caretaker and good friend, came over to our tent and said, we're leaving. We need to get your stuff together. We had a big tent that the sheikh had given us out of his tent, the big, heavy Oriental rug. And she came in and flipped that thing, rolled it up, picked it up, threw it in the back of a pickup truck, dropped our tent, folded it up, and, it's a big tent, not a pup tent. Picked that up, threw that in the truck, and said, y'all get your stuff together. We're out of here.
So strong in many ways.
Yes, strong in many ways.
So we are running out of time, but just to wrap us up, you're both artists. And what I'd really be interested in is just your quick observations about the artistic traditions that you ran across.
Well, for me,
Both of you.
what I was surprised was the lack of visual arts and plastic arts that we're familiar with here in the West. So that was surprising to me and disappointing. The arts that I learned to appreciate, one is the art of conversation. Another is the calligraphy, magnificent calligraphy. And another is the art of hospitality. It included incense, welcoming with incense, coffee, tea, sweets, dates, perfumes, very hospitable. And so these were humanistic-based arts.
One of the things that I appreciated was the way they blended life and art in their work. They would make beautiful textiles that were parts of the tent walls. Beautiful textiles that were part of the tent walls that had their own traditional designs, but also incorporated new things, like there'd be a little car or a little airplane next to a little camel, all woven in these beautiful textiles. And so I thought that was pretty special.
This has been a great interview. We've been listening to Wayne and Patti Eastep describing their experience living with the Bedouin tribe in Saudi Arabia. Thank you so much for joining us today. Is there a way for listeners to reach you or learn more about your work?
Yes, they can. I have a Facebook page, which is my name, Wayne Eastep, and Eastep is spelled E-A-S-T-E-P. And they can write me at wayneeastep@gmail.com.
If you want to learn more about this show, give us feedback, or share ideas for topics or speakers, you can find us on Facebook. Just search Let's Talk About the Middle East. If you leave an interesting comment, we'll give you a shout out on our next show. You can find this interview and others on our YouTube channel. Again, just search Let's Talk About the Middle East.
Don't forget to join us for the last in our series of events on Israel and Palestine. It'll be held a week from Sunday from 6 to 9 at Fogartyville Center. We'll be watching and discussing the film Budrus, which documents the interfaith protest movement that prevented the Israeli security wall from bisecting one Palestinian village. It's a really interesting look at how the peace movement can make a difference. Our theme music is from Merkava by the Israeli musician and peace activist Gabi Myers. Take care and spread the peace.